At 80 years old, Tom Selleck finally speaks from a place few reach with clarity. The fame, the iconic roles, the decades of public admiration, none of it shields a man from memory. When he reflects on his life now, it isn't the awards or applause that surfaced first. It's a woman. One woman, the one he never truly got over. This confession doesn't arrive with drama or regret. It comes quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the truth waited patiently for the right moment. At this stage of life there is no performance left to give, no image to protect. What remains is honesty, and that honesty reveals something deeply human, that even the strongest men carry emotional scars that time never fully erased. Tom Selleck was never known as someone who chased attention. His masculinity was calm, grounded, and controlled. He represented stability in a world obsessed with chaos. That's why this admission hits harder than expected, because it reminds us that emotional depth often hides behind composure. Strength doesn't mean forgetting. Sometimes it means learning how to live with what never left. He explains that this wasn't about a dramatic breakup or betrayal. There was no explosion, no scandal, no headline. The connection simply faded under the weight of life's demands. Careers rose, responsibilities multiplied. Time moved forward and love, unable to keep pace, was left behind. Not destroyed, just unfinished. What makes this confession powerful is the timing. At 80, nostalgia isn't romantic anymore, it's reflective. Selleck understands now that some relationships aren't meant to last forever, but they are meant to shape you. This woman came into his life at a moment when he was becoming someone else, when ambition was louder than emotion, and direction mattered more than depth. Back then, he believed there would always be more time, more chances, more opportunities to fix what felt incomplete. That illusion disappears with age. And now, looking back, he sees clearly some doors don't close because of mistakes, they close because life chooses differently. There is a particular kind of loss that doesn't wound loudly. It doesn't keep you awake every night. It doesn't stop your life. Instead, it settles quietly into your memory and stays there. This was that kind of love. The kind that doesn't hurt every day, but never truly leaves. Selleck admits that for years he didn't fully understand why this woman stayed with him emotionally. He had moved on. He had built a life. From the outside, everything looked complete. But emotionally, there was always a quiet awareness, a sense that something meaningful had ended before it was fully lived. This isn't about longing to go back. It's about acknowledging significance. At 80, he understands that not every love story is meant to finish the way we imagine. Some exist to teach us who we are before we become who we need to be. There's maturity in how he frames it now. No bitterness, no blame, just acceptance. He recognizes that the man he was then couldn't have loved her the way he knows how to love now. And perhaps that's the truth that brings peace, that timing matters as much as feeling. What makes his confession resonate is how universal it is. Many men carry one woman in their memory, not because she was perfect, but because she represents a version of themselves that no longer exists. A time when life was open, undefined, and full of possibility. As he speaks, there's no sadness in his voice, only understanding. He doesn't wish to change the past. He simply honors it. And in doing so, he shows that emotional honesty isn't weakness, it's wisdom earned over time. At 80, Tom Selleck isn't confessing failure. He's acknowledging truth. That love doesn't always mean permanence. That some people are meant to stay in your heart, not your life. And that even a man admired for strength and control can carry one unfinished chapter quietly, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what once mattered deeply. In the years when Tom Selleck's career finally began to accelerate, life stopped moving slowly. Opportunities arrived one after another, and with each yes, something else had to be placed on hold. This was the season when everything felt possible, but nothing felt balanced. Fame doesn't ask whether you are emotionally ready, it simply demands your full attention. And during this exact window, the woman he would never fully forget was still in his life. Their connection wasn't built on fantasy. It was grounded, natural, and real. There was comfort in each other's presence, the kind that doesn't need constant reassurance. But as Selleck's visibility grew, so did the distance. Not emotional distance at first, practical distance. Time apart, missed moments, promises postponed. Hollywood didn't pull him away in one dramatic move. It slowly stretched his life until something had to tear. He later admitted that during that period he believed sacrifice was temporary. He told himself that love could wait, that once the momentum slowed, everything important would still be there. That belief is common among driven men. Ambition convinces you that relationships are patient by default. Reality, however, doesn't work that way. As auditions turned into roles and roles turned into recognition, the expectations multiplied. There were schedules to follow, images to maintain, and decisions being made by people who had no stake in his personal life. The more his career demanded presence, the less emotional space he had to offer. And love, no matter how strong, cannot survive indefinitely on intention alone. What makes this story different is that nothing went wrong in the traditional sense. There was no argument big enough to point to, no betrayal dramatic enough to blame, just a slow realization on both sides that they were no longer moving at the same pace. She needed consistency, he needed momentum, and neither was wrong. Selleck has reflected that this was the first time he learned a difficult truth. Timing can end relationships more effectively than conflict. When two people are aligned emotionally but misaligned in life, love becomes exhausting instead of supportive, and eventually someone chooses peace over possibility. When the relationship ended, it didn't feel final. That's what made it dangerous. There was no emotional closure, no clean break, just an understanding that now wasn't the right time. And when relationships end like that, they don't truly end, they linger. For years afterward, that unfinished feeling followed him, not as pain, but as awareness. Whenever life slowed down, whenever success felt oddly hollow, the memory resurfaced. Not the person exactly, but the version of himself he was when everything still felt open. She represented a time before his life was fully defined by responsibility. He admits now that fame accelerated his growth in some areas while stunting it in others. Professionally, he matured fast. Emotionally, he postponed certain lessons. That relationship taught him later what it couldn't teach him then. That presence is more valuable than potential. Looking back, he doesn't frame himself as the victim. He understands that choices were made consciously. He chose the path that shaped his future, knowing something meaningful would be lost in the process. At the time, the loss felt acceptable. With age, it simply feels significant. There is a quiet honesty in how he describes that period now. He doesn't romanticize struggle. He doesn't exaggerate regret. He simply acknowledges that success came with invisible costs, costs that don't show up in biographies or interviews, but stay with you privately. What stayed with him most was not the relationship itself, but the lesson it left behind. That love needs presence more than promise. That people cannot pause their emotional needs indefinitely. And that ambition, when left unchecked, can quietly replace connection. At 80, he understands that this woman didn't leave because he failed her. She left because life demanded something different from both of them. And perhaps that is why she remains unforgettable. Not because of what they had, but because of what they never fully got the chance to become. This chapter of his life doesn't carry bitterness. It carries clarity. The clarity that comes when you finally see your past without ego, without defense, just truth. And that truth explains why, decades later, one woman still holds a quiet place in his memory, not as a regret, but as a reminder of the cost of becoming who you are. As time moved forward, Tom Selleck did what most men do after an important chapter closes. He continued building his life. New roles came, public recognition grew, and eventually stability replaced uncertainty. From the outside, everything appeared settled. He married, created a private world away from Hollywood, and chose a quieter version of success. Yet emotional memory does not obey time. It doesn't disappear simply because life moves on. He has admitted that for a long time. He believed moving forward meant leaving the past behind. But age teaches a different truth. You don't erase the past, you integrate it. And the woman he never fully got over wasn't a disruption to his present life. She existed quietly in memory, resurfacing only in moments of stillness. This wasn't longing in the traditional sense. He didn't wish to return or rewrite history. What stayed was understanding. She represented a version of himself that existed before certainty, before routine, before emotional restraint became necessary. And that version never completely vanished. It simply matured. In the years that followed, Selleck noticed something subtle. Certain emotional reactions, certain standards, even certain boundaries were shaped by that early love. He didn't compare women to her consciously, but she had helped define what depth felt like. When you experience a connection that arrives before life hardens you, it leaves a permanent imprint. There were moments, not dramatic but quiet, when memory would surface. Late nights after filming, long drives when the world felt distant. Silence has a way of bringing clarity, and clarity has a way of inviting memory. In those moments, he didn't feel sadness. He felt recognition. Recognition that some relationships do not end. They evolve into reference points. He also came to understand why the relationship couldn't have survived who he was becoming. At that stage of life, he was still learning how to be present, how to listen without distraction, how to prioritize emotional connection without feeling confined by it. The man he became later would have loved differently, but that man did not yet exist. This realization removed regret. Regret assumes failure. What he felt instead was acceptance. Acceptance that growth requires loss, and that certain people enter your life to prepare you for what comes next, not to stay with you forever. As his personal life stabilized, he became more intentional about privacy. Fame had shown him what exposure costs, and perhaps that lesson began in that early relationship where love suffered under attention, pressure, and absence. He learned that intimacy needs protection, not display. The woman he never got over did not disrupt his marriage or his loyalty. Instead, she sharpened his awareness. She reminded him of the importance of presence, of choosing connection deliberately, of not assuming that time alone sustains relationships. What stayed with him was not desire, but gratitude. Gratitude for an experience that shaped his emotional intelligence. Gratitude for a love that showed him what depth felt like, even if it arrived before he was ready to hold it properly. At 80, he reflects on memory differently. Memory is no longer something to escape or suppress. It becomes a companion, a witness to who you were and how you arrived where you are. He doesn't revisit the past to live in it, but to understand himself more clearly. This chapter of his life taught him that moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying the past without letting it control you, and that balance is rare. It requires maturity, honesty, and the humility to admit that not everything meaningful is meant to last forever. He now understands that some people stay with you not because you need them, but because they helped build you. They are part of your emotional architecture. Removing them would mean denying your own history. And so when he speaks of her now, it isn't with emotion in his voice, it's with respect. Respect for what was shared, respect for what was learned, and respect for the quiet truth that certain loves leave marks that time doesn't erase, only softens at this stage of life. That understanding brings peace. Not closure in the dramatic sense, but clarity. The clarity that allows a man to look back without pain, forward without fear, and inward without denial. And that is why, even after a full life, one woman remains unforgettable, not as a longing, but as a chapter that shaped the man he became. As Tom Selleck grew older, his understanding of love shifted in ways he never expected. Youth had taught him intensity, success had taught him discipline, but time taught him something far more valuable: emotional precision. By the time he reached his later years, he no longer confused attachment with love, or presence with permanence. And it was from this place of clarity that he finally understood why one woman remained with him emotionally. Long after life had moved on, he began to notice a pattern not just in his own life, but in the lives of other men. Men rarely talk about the one woman they never fully got over, not because it still hurts, but because it feels private. That kind of memory doesn't demand attention. It exists quietly, almost protectively, like something sacred. And for many men, that woman represents a moment when life still felt undefined, when identity had not yet hardened. Selleck realized that this wasn't about romance, it was about meaning. That early connection occurred before the world told him who he was supposed to be, before fame, before expectation, before responsibility reshaped his priorities. She loved him before his life had structure, and that made the experience fundamentally different from what came later. With age, he also recognized how men process loss differently. Men tend to move forward without fully processing what they leave behind. They focus on building, achieving, stabilizing. Emotional reflection often comes later, sometimes decades later, and when it does, it arrives without anger or longing, but with understanding. The woman he never got over wasn't a comparison to his wife or his life choices. She was a reminder of emotional openness, of vulnerability before strategy, of loving without calculation. That's why her memory stayed intact. It was tied to authenticity, not outcome. He also understood that timing plays a brutal role in love. Two people can be deeply compatible and still fail to align, not because of lack of effort, but because growth doesn't always happen simultaneously. One person evolves faster, the other needs stability. And when paths diverge at the wrong moment, love becomes collateral damage. What separates maturity from regret is how you interpret those moments later. Selleck didn't blame himself endlessly, nor did he idealize the past. He accepted that the man he was then could not have sustained what he understands now, and that acceptance freed him from emotional conflict. There's a quiet strength in admitting that some relationships are meant to exist only within a certain version of yourself. When that version ends, the relationship must end with it. Holding on would have meant resisting growth. As he aged, he noticed that this kind of emotional honesty deepened his relationships rather than weakening them. He became more present, more deliberate, more aware of the fragility of connection. Loss taught him how to protect love. This is why his confession resonates so deeply, especially with men. It speaks to a universal experience rarely expressed, that we carry certain people not because we want them back, but because they helped shape our emotional identity. He also came to understand that memory itself changes with age. It softens edges. It removes bitterness. What remains is essence. And the essence of that woman was not heartbreak, it was clarity. By the time he reached 80, he could look back without nostalgia controlling him. He wasn't stuck in the past, he was informed by it. That difference matters. One traps you, the other teaches you. He now sees that love doesn't need to last forever to be real. Some loves are transitional, not temporary, but transformational. They exist to open you emotionally, then step aside when life demands evolution. And perhaps that is why this story feels less like a confession and more like a reflection. There is no sorrow in his voice, only awareness. Awareness that some people enter your life to teach you how deeply you can feel, not how long you can hold on. At this stage of life, he no longer asks what if. He asks, what did it give me? And the answer is clear. It gave him emotional depth, restraint, and perspective. It taught him that strength and vulnerability are not opposites, but partners. So when he speaks of the woman he never got over, he isn't revealing a wound. He is acknowledging a foundation, a quiet, invisible part of his life that helped shape the man the world came to admire, not despite the loss, but because of it.